"Let me rest somewhere safe," said the hurt alien, "and I'm obliged to warm your bed." In a small town nestled between hills, life was simple. People knew each other, and every decision made rippled through the community. The residents of the town valued tradition, and everyone respected the wisdom that had been passed down from generation to generation. But among them there was one person who always seemed to stand apart, a person who believed in forging their own path, regardless of the consequences. This person was known to everyone in the town, not just for their defiance, but for their charm and confidence. They were respected by some, feared by others, but always admired for their unshakable belief in their own judgment. However, that confidence would soon lead to a mistake, one that would turn the whole town against them. One day this person made a decision. It was a decision that the townspeople never saw coming. A change was coming that would challenge everything they had believed in. The idea was simple on the surface, but the consequences, as they would soon find out, would be far-reaching. They had made their mind up, and no one's warnings could shake them. It wasn't long before the townspeople gathered together in a local meeting hall to discuss the decision. The air was thick with tension as the news spread like wildfire. Some were worried about the potential harm the decision could cause. Others were outright furious, fearing that this person's choice would bring disaster. "Don't do it," they pleaded. But the person, standing firm, wasn't swayed by their concerns. They believed they knew best. "This is my decision," they said, "and I won't back down." Those who had known this person for years had always admired their courage, but now they were beginning to question whether their confidence was blinding them to the truth.
"You're making a mistake," some whispered.
But no one dared to speak louder than that, knowing that the person could be stubborn to the point of being unreachable. The meeting broke up in a cloud of anger and confusion. There was no going back now. The person's decision had been made, and no amount of pleading would change their mind. As the days passed, the consequences of that decision began to unfold. At first, the town hoped that things would work out. Maybe the person's plan was indeed better than anyone had realized. But soon enough, it became clear that things were not going according to plan. The decision that had been made so confidently was starting to have its effects. People began to notice the subtle changes, the small shifts that suggested something was wrong. A ripple of unease spread through the town. The decisions this person had made weren't just affecting their own life, they were affecting the entire community. The once peaceful streets began to feel less welcoming. The relationships that had held the town together for so long began to crack under the weight of the decision. People who had once been friends now found themselves arguing over what had gone wrong. Tensions ran high as the person's choice started to take its toll. The person, however, seemed oblivious to the growing unrest around them. They continued to carry on, convinced that their decision was still the right one. They had not anticipated the anger that would rise, nor the damage that would come from their actions. The community had always been close-knit, but now the divide between those who supported the decision and those who opposed it was becoming too large to ignore. Whispers began to spread. What were they thinking? Someone would say, "Bray." "I knew something like this would happen," another would add. The cracks in the town's unity were becoming impossible to ignore. The person's decision was no longer just an individual choice. It had become a point of contention for everyone. Even those who had tried to stay neutral found themselves pulled into the conflict. The once vibrant gatherings at the town's small cafe were now filled with heated discussions. Where there had been laughter, now there were only accusations. The community that had always stood together was now divided, and the person's actions were at the center of it all. The person, still unaware of the depth of the consequences, continued to move forward with their plan. Breath. They didn't listen to the complaints or the warnings. They couldn't see what was so obvious to everyone else. The town was angry. People were losing trust in one another, and nothing was getting better. It wasn't just the anger that was worrying. It was the disappointment. The community had always expected more from this person. They had believed that, despite their independence, they had the town's best interests at heart. Now, it seemed like that belief had been misplaced. The damage that had been done was growing larger with each passing day, and still, the person didn't listen. There was a growing sense of regret among the townspeople. They had warned them, and yet nothing had changed. If only they had listened, people said to each other. Maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But there was no turning back now. The damage had been done. The person was starting to realize that the town wasn't just angry. They were furious. But even then, they weren't ready to admit they had made a mistake. Instead, they continued to believe that they could fix everything, even if no one else agreed. But with every passing day, the town's fury grew. It wasn't just the person's actions. It was the fact that they hadn't listened to the warnings, the advice, the concerns of everyone who cared. Breath. And that, more than anything, was what had angered the town the most. It wasn't the decision itself. It was the refusal to hear the people who had tried to help. As the days stretched on, the anger within the town only intensified. What was once a peaceful community was now a place of tense silence, where even the smallest conversations carried an undercurrent of frustration. The townspeople began to distance themselves from the person who had caused the rift, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had been formed. No matter how much they tried to explain, the person remained stubborn, convinced that they were in the right. The change was becoming impossible to ignore. Businesses began to suffer. People stopped coming to town meetings, choosing instead to avoid conflict by staying home. The once bustling marketplace was quieter now, and whispers of discontent echoed through the streets. Even the friendships that had lasted for decades were beginning to fray. People who had once shared everything were now avoiding one another, caught in the middle of an argument that felt never-ending. The person's decision, though seemingly small at first, had turned into a snowball of issues that no one had anticipated. It wasn't just about the one choice anymore. It was about the lack of trust, the broken relationships, and the way it seemed to change the very spirit of the town. The townspeople had wanted to avoid conflict, to remain united, but now they found themselves fighting over something that seemed impossible to fix. The person, meanwhile, still couldn't see the full picture. They didn't realize how much their stubbornness had affected everyone around them. To them, it was just a matter of making the right call, of standing firm on a decision they believed in. But to the others, it was a matter of losing everything they valued: family, friendship, and the sense of community that had always kept them together. There were moments when the person felt the weight of the anger, the subtle glances, and the cold shoulders, but they couldn't bring themselves to apologize. Admitting they were wrong wasn't something they were prepared to do. They believed that if they just held their ground long enough, the anger would fade, and the town would return to normal. But that hope seemed more distant with each passing day. The division in the town grew wider. Some still supported the person, not because they agreed with the decision, but because they felt a sense of loyalty. They didn't want to believe that someone they trusted had made such a catastrophic mistake. These few tried to speak up, tried to bridge the gap, but their efforts fell flat. The majority of the town, however, couldn't find a way to forgive the decision that had been made. They felt betrayed, and the hurt was too deep. At night, the once quiet town square now felt empty. The local cafe where the townspeople used to gather to chat and laugh now stood almost abandoned. The person occasionally wandered past, noticing the absence of familiar faces, but they couldn't bring themselves to face the reality of what had happened. To them, it still felt like they had made the right choice. Yet, as time passed, they couldn't ignore the consequences any longer. The town was slowly unraveling, and even the few who had supported them were beginning to lose hope. They started to question if this person had truly understood the weight of their actions, or if they were too consumed by their own pride to see the damage they had caused. The person began to realize that their decision, while still something they believed in, had come with a price they hadn't anticipated. The town wasn't just angry, they were hurt. And no amount of stubbornness could undo the emotional damage that had been done. For the first time, they started to understand that what had been broken wasn't just the town's harmony. It was the trust that everyone had once shared. It was a painful realization, but one that couldn't be ignored any longer. The town was fractured, and the person was at the center of it all. Every step they took seemed to push them further away from the people they had once been close to. The gap between them and the rest of the town was growing larger, and they were no closer to finding a way to fix it. As the weeks continued to pass, the person found themselves trapped in a growing sense of isolation. The town that had once felt like home now felt like a distant memory. They couldn't escape the feeling of loneliness that crept in every time they walked through the empty streets. Everywhere they looked, they saw signs of the damage their decision had caused.
The town's once tight-knit community had fractured beyond recognition.
What had started as a disagreement was now a full-blown divide, and the person was at the center of it. There were no more warm greetings or friendly conversations. Instead, there were awkward silences and sidelong glances. It was clear that the town no longer trusted them, and the weight of that distrust was starting to crush them. It wasn't just the people who were angry. It was the whole atmosphere of the place. The lively town, once full of energy and life, now felt dull and somber. The streets, once filled with bustling crowds, now seemed empty. The local businesses were struggling, and many families were facing hardship. It was as if the very heart of the town had been torn apart by one person's decision. The person had always been independent, relying on their own instincts and beliefs to guide them. But now, they began to see the value of the town's unity, of the way everyone had worked together to build something strong and lasting. They saw the way people had come together in times of need, the way they had shared in both joy and sorrow, and they began to realize that they had taken all of that for granted. But it was too late to turn back the clock. The damage was done. The rift was too wide, and no amount of apologies or promises could fix it. The person had made their choice, and now they were forced to live with the consequences. The town would never be the same, and neither would they. Despite all the pain and regret, there was a part of the person that still believed they had made the right decision. Breaths. They had followed their instincts, even when everyone else disagreed. And while they couldn't undo the harm they had caused, they knew that they had acted according to their own truth. But the real question remained: would the town ever forgive them? Could they rebuild the trust that had been lost? The person didn't know the answer, but one thing was clear: things would never be the same again. The town had changed, and so had they. The journey from here would not be easy, but they knew that they had to face the consequences of their actions. They would have to find a way to repair the damage, not just to the town, but to themselves. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was the only one left to take. The days seemed to drag on, and the weight of the past months began to feel unbearable. The town was still divided, but now there was a new sense of weariness hanging over it. People had stopped arguing so loudly, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The once cheerful streets were now filled with a quiet tension, and the community that had once been tightly knit was now just a collection of distant individuals. For the person who had caused it all, the reality of the situation had finally begun to sink in. They could no longer ignore the damage that had been done. The town wasn't the same, and neither were they. Every time they passed someone in the street, there was a hint of resentment in their eyes. The conversations that had once been casual now felt heavy, as if everyone was just pretending that nothing had changed, when in reality, everything had. In moments of reflection, the person started to question their own choices. Could they have handled things differently? Should they have listened to the warnings and advice of others? The answers didn't come easily. They had always believed in their ability to stand firm in their decisions, but now that very trait seemed like a mistake. The confidence they once had now felt like a burden, something that had led them down a path of loneliness and regret. Despite all of this, there was still a small part of them that refused to let go of their belief. They couldn't bring themselves to admit that they had been wrong. Not entirely. In their heart, they still felt that their decision had been the right one. They had followed their own instincts after all, and no one else had truly understood what was at stake. But as time went on, that belief was becoming harder to hold on to. It wasn't just the anger and disappointment of the townspeople that weighed heavily on their mind. It was the realization that they had lost something far more valuable than any argument or disagreement. They had lost the trust and the unity that had once bound them to the people around them. They had always been an independent person, someone who didn't rely on others. But now, that independence seemed hollow. In the end, they realized that no matter how strong a person was, no one could thrive in isolation. As the weeks passed, there were small signs that things might be starting to change. The town had grown quieter. The anger had dulled a little, and some people were beginning to speak again, though cautiously. It wasn't the same as it had been, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, the person felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild what had been broken. They began to make small efforts to reach out to the people they had wronged. At first, it was awkward. The conversations were stilted, and the mistrust was still there. But there was something important in those moments. It wasn't about apologizing or fixing everything all at once. It was about showing that they cared, that they were willing to try and make amends. Slowly, people started to listen. Slowly, the walls that had been built between them began to crack, just a little. But even with these small steps, the journey of healing was far from over. The trust that had been lost couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and the scars from the past would take time to fade. There would be moments when things felt impossible, when the anger and disappointment from before seemed too much to overcome. But through it all, there was a new understanding, one that came from accepting responsibility for their actions and realizing that no decision was worth losing the connections that mattered most. The person had learned a difficult lesson, one that could never be unlearned. They had learned that standing firm in your beliefs is important, but so is listening to the people around you. They had learned that sometimes being strong means admitting that you've made a mistake and trying to make it right. And above all, they had learned that no matter how independent you are, the people around you matter more than anything else. The road ahead was still uncertain. The town would never be the same, and neither would they. But with each passing day, there was a little more peace, a little more understanding. The person knew that it would take time, but with patience and humility, maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. It wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to try. And as the town moved forward, there was a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. A hope that, despite everything that had happened, things could still get better. The person didn't know what the future held, but they knew that it was time to move forward, to stop looking back at the past, and to start rebuilding not just the town, but themselves as well. Person walked through the streets again, not with the same arrogance they once had, but with a quiet resolve. They had learned that strength wasn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it was about coming together with others to heal the wounds of the past. It wasn't too late to make things right, and as long as they kept trying, there was still hope for a brighter tomorrow. And so, the journey of healing began. Not just for the town, but for the person who had started it all. The road was long, but with each step they moved closer to the forgiveness and peace they had once thought was impossible.